Hi there, welcome to our Holy Week Daily Devotional for Thursday. Now today, Thursday, is traditionally called Maundy Thursday within the mainline churches. And so you might ask, okay, well what does that mean? Maundy is a Latin word that comes from the word that means just to command. And so this day is a special day that recognizes the command that Jesus gave for us to love one another as we have been loved. And that text is in today's reading. So I'd like to read John chapter 13. We're going to back up from what we read yesterday and read the first part of the chapter, verses 1 to 17, and then skip down to verse 31 and read 31 to 35. So, starting John chapter 13, verse 1. Now before the festival of the Passover, Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart from this world and to go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. The devil had already put into the heart of Judas, son of Simon Iscariot, to betray him. And during supper, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hand, and that he had come from the Father and was going to God, got up from the table, took off his outer robe, and tied a towel around himself. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel that was wrapped around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" Jesus answered, "You don't know now what I'm doing, but later you will understand." Peter said to him, "You will never wash my feet." Jesus answered, "Unless I wash you, you have no share in me." Simon Peter said to him, "Lord, not only my feet, but also my hands and my head." Jesus said to him, "One who has bathed does not need to wash except for his feet, but is entirely clean. And you are clean, though not all of you." For he knew who was to betray him, and for this reason he said, "Not all of you are clean." After he had washed their feet, he put on his robe, and he had returned to the table. He said to them, "Do you know what I have done for you? You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am. So if I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash the feet of one another. For I have set you an example that you should do, as I have done to you. Verily, I say to you, a servant is not greater than his master, nor are messengers greater than the one who sent them. If you know these things, you are blessed if you do them." Then down to verse 31. Jesus said, "Now the Son of Man has been glorified, and God has been glorified in him. If God has been glorified in him, God will also glorify him in himself, and will glorify him at once. Little children, I am with you only a little while longer. You will look for me, and as I've said to the Jews, now I say to you, where I'm going, you cannot come. I give you a new command, that you love one another, just as I have loved you. You also should love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." So in this text, we have this really striking example in answer to the question that we've been talking about all week. Who is this guy, Jesus? What does Jesus represent, or what are we to learn from this? So in our culture today, we don't have an appreciation for what foot washing would have meant. For us, this is an extremely odd and weird symbol, something that we have a little bit of difficulty identifying with. But in Jesus' time, they would walk dusty roads, they would have sandals, or walk bare feet entirely. And when you came into the house, there would be a lot of dirt and a lot of dust coming in that way. Now in Canada, we have a tradition of taking shoes off at the door and just kind of leaving the shoe and all that at the door. I know some of my American friends always find that a little odd when Canadians come for a visit. They're taking their shoes off and making themselves feel comfortable. But in Jesus' day and age, it was an idea that when you arrived home, or when you arrived as a guest at a home, someone would be there that would wash feet. It would typically be the lowest servant. It was considered a pretty menial job. Not everybody was even willing to do it. The lowest of the servants would wash feet. Now, what has likely happened here is Jesus is using rented facilities. This is a home that's got an upper room that's big enough for Jesus and all his disciples, all 12 of his followers, to just meet around a table and partake of the Passover meal together. And so they would have arrived, and it appears no one was willing to kind of take that role, and so they all kind of came in and just left their feet as they were. No one was willing to take that role as a servant. And so Jesus, when he stands up from the table, he's taking care of a very practical and a very kind of immediate need, but he does it in a tremendously symbolic way. Jesus, who is the rabbi, who is the teacher, who is the one who is considered the most honored in the group, takes not just a slightly lower position, but he takes the lowest position. He takes the position of the lowest slave. And you can see it in Peter's response. We see a little bit of Peter's character here too. Peter initially rejects the idea. He's embarrassed for Jesus. No, I'm not going to let you wash my feet. Don't be silly. And then Jesus says, well, if I don't wash my feet, you have no part of me. If you don't allow me to serve you in the way that I'm about to serve you, then you have no part of my ministry. You have no place. In other words, for us to be a follower of Jesus, we need to allow Jesus to serve us in this way, in the way that Jesus will serve the whole community of followers on Good Friday, which we'll talk about tomorrow. So Peter initially rejects it when Jesus says, no, you have to let me serve you. Then Peter goes, flip the other side. Okay, well then give me a whole body bath. And then Jesus is like, no. If you've been washed, you're clean. I'm just doing this, as a symbolic gesture. Part of Maundy Thursday is to observe this foot washing tradition. And so in some churches, they have foot washing ceremonies where they have a couple people in their church that are designated as the foot washers. And then people who are willing to have their feet washed will come and receive this. And so this sort of sign act that Jesus participates in is reenacted. One of the most amazing examples of that comes out of the Catholic tradition. Now, traditionally, the Pope would wash cardinals and bishops' feet. So some of the higher uppity-ups within the Catholic Church would be selected to have this great honor to sit in these gilded chairs and have the Pope, the acting Pope at the time, come and wash his feet. Well, if you know anything about Pope Francis, he's turned that tradition entirely on its head. He each year takes a whole new approach. This past year, in 2019, he took a bunch of inmates from a prison in Rome, and he washed their feet. In a message that he shared afterwards, he encouraged the inmates in this prison to stop observing the hierarchical nature of life in prison, to take the servant role, to love one another, to serve one another, which sounds like a pretty odd thing to be saying to a bunch of prisoners, but I mean, he's the Pope, he can get away with it. A few years before that, he did something similar where he washed the feet of refugees from all over the world, from a variety of different countries. And so there were Muslims, and there were Coptic Christians, there were Hindu followers, there were some Catholics, there were people with no faith at all. And the Pope washed their feet, and in the message that followed said that we are all, in every nation, not identified by our nationality, but instead we're all identified as children of God, as God's children. A profound use of this symbol that we see here in John chapter 13. So what is it that we're looking at here? What are we to learn from this story? Jesus takes the servant role, and in doing that, he demonstrates the nature of the love that God has for us. We see in this story here in John chapter 13 that God stoops to serve. That God does not just deliver a blessing from a distance or engage humanity sort of with an arm's length, but what we see here is the loving, compassionate heart of God, that God comes near, that God interacts with people, that God takes the lowest role, the servant role, and serves the people that he loves. And then finally, this last little bit, we haven't had a lot of commands in these readings that we've been looking at this week, but here on Thursday we have this text that in the manner that I have served you, you ought to serve one another. So a question that you could maybe ask yourself is, while we are sheltered in place, while we are in quarantine, or while we are in closed quarters with our families, what are some ways that you can serve the people that you live with? In what ways can you reach out in the name of Jesus, sort of consistent with the way of Jesus? How can you live the love that God gives to us? How can you live that love for the people that you're living with? Something to think about. See you tomorrow.